The TARDIS was far quieter than usual when it happened. The Doctor was in a state that he was quite used to now, which was to say he was alone. Even K9 had left, which, to be frank, was just adding insult to injury. Not for the first time, the Doctor privately lamented how very mutable all his friendships seemed to be. Still, in many ways there were benefits to travelling alone, and there were some spectacular sights to be seen that he'd never risk bringing a human to. The luminescent cyanide fountains of Aratri 5 were his current destination. He'd pass a lovely afternoon or two bathing, and after that, the Doctor would do as he always had done, meandering from place to place until there was something worth seeing in front of him. The ever-familiar hum and beeping of the TARDIS grew more distressed for a moment, and the time rotor seemed to pause. Then, the whole machine heaved, turning like it was sick, jolting the Doctor out of his thoughts and forcing him to grip the edge of the console just to stay upright. He muttered under his breath and reached across to flick a switch, only for the ship to lurch again and threaten to send him tumbling as he clung on for dear life. The rotor whirred, just a hair too fast, a sound dangerously close to panic, and a second later, thump, he'd landed. He checked the ship's coordinates and came up with a blank. Wherever he was, it certainly was not Aratri 5. The Doctor frowned.
Curious.
To say the hallway he emerged into was dark would do it an injustice. It was sheer, dead, lifeless. A dull stench seemed to fill the air, one the Doctor quickly identified as rot.
Very curious indeed,
he murmured to himself, more to fill the silence than anything else. The smell of death was a logical impossibility. In a place so devoid of flesh, there ought to be nothing to decay. Some quiet instinct at the base of his heart urged him to turn and leave. He paid it no heed and pressed forward into the moor before him. The darkness refused to recede as he advanced, but to his very great surprise, he came upon a door. Something that could convincingly pass as stone. Under his fingers, the texture was rough, but betrayed none of the flaws of true stone. It was a mockery, an imitation, carved in some hollow memory of how stone ought to feel. Lifeless, like everything else. Gingerly, the Doctor pushed the door open. The next hallway was much the same. A greyish-brown gloom suffused it, quiet as a grave and heavier than earth. Bars lined the wall when he moved to lay a hand on them. Around him, the suffusing scent of rot grew even stronger. In the absence of light, the Doctor's hearing intensified. The same smooth, undirtied faux stone that had composed the walls shuffled minutely under his shoes, and the rustle of his long scarf seemed incongruously loud against the beating of his sickened heart, continuing to churn as he pressed down the hall blindly. He must have been walking for quite a while, because his thoughts began to wander. The lack of stimulation made it almost impossible to not reflect inward. Something about this place. The bars suggested some sort of prison, but the peculiar scent in the air was not that of the captured. Set an ache in his teeth. Something heavy and familiar blocking his throat. Whatever force had called him here, dead or alive, had been powerful enough to divert the TARDIS off her course. That in itself was worth investigating. And yet, the unnatural fear he felt was growing ever more oppressive, paradoxically driving his curiosity even higher. That strange feeling still gave him pause, though. He'd never been one for turning back, but the atmosphere here was both unlike anything he had experienced before, and yet so agonizingly familiar. He was sure the disquiet under his heart would settle if only he could place it, but this stuffy emptiness was draining him, and it took all of his effort just to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Some time later, the Doctor realised that his sight was beginning to return. Somewhere in this near infinite darkness, there was something like a light. Almost without thinking, his steps began to pick up pace, the click of his soles filling the oppressive silence with muffled echoes. Far in the distance, the Doctor heard an unmistakable rattling.
Hello?
He called out, the sound of his own voice an alien comfort.
Is anybody there? I'm looking for an explanation, if that's all right with you.
The darkness yielded no response as he advanced further into it, except a dull echo of his own words. But as surely as the stench of rotten flesh filled the air, the light grew stronger as he advanced. The funny thing about knowing something here was dying was that it necessarily implied the opposite. Something here was still alive. In a single moment, the realization rushed into the doctor all at once, almost knocked him off his feet. The air here was identical to that of the bitterest moments of his childhood, those secret places deep beneath the ground he had haunted in his adolescence. It was the same smell that haunted the catacombs of Gallifrey and the tombs of the Time Lords. His racing heart sank at last. Wherever he was, whatever the meaning of this dungeon, it was soon to house the corpse of one of his own. A dying Time Lord was not an attractive thing. The process of decay was almost a perfect antithesis to regeneration. Slow, unglamorous, painful, or so he'd heard. For a creature made of time and anima as much as space and matter, death stifled more than just the flesh. It was the terminus of the ego, the impossible end of an infinite line, the cobwebby strands of time briefly malforming around its absence. The smog of it pressed disagreeably against the doctor's senses, the ignoble setting even more so. Ordinarily, those about to die chose creature comforts and the soft surroundings, not the sterile gloom of this dark prison. Deep in the shadow, curled beneath the feeble light from the cell window at the end of the hall, a figure lifted its head.
Master,
said the doctor. It couldn't have been anyone else. To the doctor's great surprise and his even greater suspicion, the master did not move. It was impossible to make out his face in this gloom. Impenetrable shadows hung over the both of them. As the doctor approached the bars, he could discern nothing more of the man than the thinness of his frame. He's dead, the doctor thought suddenly. That particular sickness in his heart slowly began to make a horrible sort of sense. It wasn't just the feeling of a dying Time Lord that gave the sense such a specific and terrible familiarity, but that of a very specific Time Lord, one whose waning mind he knew as intimately as his own, and more deeply than either had words to express. Within moments, he had the metal-barred entrance to the cell open with the sonic screwdriver and rushed inside. The door swung shut with a jarringly loud clang as he knelt down to peer into the master's face. The second he saw him, the doctor knew it was too late. When he'd entered the corridor, the master had still been alive, and moments before he'd made it inside. The master's corpse was a rather unattractive thing. The last time the doctor had seen the master, he certainly hadn't been in the best shape. But this was on another level entirely. He was far beyond the skeletal withering of his final regeneration now. His eyes were like old coins, opaque and yellowed. His skin was so dry that it was flaking away, disconcertingly thin, and the doctor fancied that the last rushes of his lifeblood might even have been visible in his veins. The rest of him was swaddled in a faded cloak, just about failing to hide the wickedly bright glint of manacles around what must have once been wrists. For a moment, the doctor lingered, stared at him. A desperate emotion he couldn't even attempt to start processing slowly filled his stomach, threatening to steal the breath from his lungs. He glanced up briefly to examine the barred window above the master's head. He hadn't died in the dark, at least, and the walls of the cell were oddly pristine, like the rest of the place. Something cold and rigid folded around his wrist. The doctor looked down in mild surprise, and then up again into the still face of the master, whose skeletal hand was locked around his sleeve. The master's jaw ground open like a stone being heaved from the mouth of a tomb.
Doctor.
It shouldn't have been possible. The The doctor could barely breathe around the stench of death emanating from the master, and yet, though his movements were laborious and his voice was barely audible, he couldn't pull his wrist from his grip.
You can't be alive,
the doctor said, blunt and aghast.
And yet,
the master replied hoarsely.
Here we are.
A silence passed between them. Merely a moment, but it may as well have been an eternity. The master released the doctor at last and folded his knees, or what remained of them, up to his chest to make space in the cell.
Sit down, Doctor.
His response was automatic.
No.
Don't you want to know why I brought you here?
It was a good point. Nothing about this made sense in the slightest after all, and given the master's condition, it seemed likely if the doctor were to leave now, then he wouldn't get an opportunity to ask these questions again. Besides, what could be the harm in it? Aside from the fact that this was certainly a trap, the doctor didn't have anything to lose by staying a while. In fact, were he a betting man, he would put money on the TARDIS being unable to take off for the time being, torn off her course as she had been. Presuming, of course, that whatever the master had done to force a landing here hadn't put her out of commission completely. Against his better judgment, the doctor sat. The faint light from the cell window seemed almost blinding in the darkness. He narrowed his eyes a little against it as he got straight to the point.
Go on then. What is it you want?
A raspy exhale filled the space between them.
I am dying, Doctor.
I can see that,
he muttered.
It pains me to ask this of you,
the master said carefully.
But
a slow inhale, somehow even more strained than before.
I need your help.
Now that was something he hadn't been expecting to hear. The doctor paused for a moment, gauging the best way to respond.
What is it I'm here to do?
The master's expression drew even more taut, his cracked and charred skin twisting over his bones. Something about his reluctance was fascinating to the doctor. Wordlessly, the master extended a hand. The doctor eyed it with suspicion and, for a moment, considered fleeing. It would be the easiest thing in the world. He could picture it, gathering his coat around him and standing up in a single motion, striding out of whatever ugly spiderweb the master was trying to weave, and never thinking of it, or him, again. He clasped it, out of curiosity, of course, and nothing else. It was an icy and unsatisfying sensation, like greeting a mannequin, like shaking hands with death herself.
I need to take your regeneration energy.
Immediately, the doctor wrenched his hand away.
Absolutely not.
The master's arm fell, and the doctor scoffed, feeling an inexplicable sort of guilt at how easy it had been to break his grip.
This is a petty sort of trick even for you, Master. You should at least try to make your attempts to kill me less obvious.
Stiffening, he uncrossed his legs and made to stand, turning from the master.
Not to mention, it's impossible anyway. You can't just drain whatever you want from me. You'd be cheating the laws of regeneration.
Not so,
said the master.
The process is a simple one. I could perform it here and now. I only need your consent.
Well, you don't have it.
The doctor tugged at the door, mildly relieved to see it hadn't been locked behind him.
Goodbye, Master.
Don't run away from me.
The words ought to have been hollow, but something in his voice stayed the doctor, just for a moment. It wasn't an over-honeyed false plea. There was too much weight in it for that, too much command, but it didn't carry any menace. It sounded almost genuine. The doctor couldn't remember the last time he'd thought of the master as genuine. That strange feeling didn't abate as the master made his plea.
Would you at least hear my end of the story before you make your decision?
On the doctor's silence and stillness, he continued.
You want to know how I am still alive. The premise of the question is wrong. You should be asking yourself why my mind is not faded in death.
So you are dead?
Yes, and no.
He presented his gnarled and translucent palms to the doctor from the formless swaddle of his cloak.
I still have some degree of control over my body, but soon that will leave me too.
The doctor paused.
And your mind?
The bones around the master's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. Slightly belatedly, the doctor realised he was trying to smile.
How familiar are you with the process of decomposition, Doctor?
He had a terrible idea he knew where this was going.
No more than is reasonable.
You're fortunate.
The master's hands lowered slowly, almost involuntarily.
Two hearts do not make for a quick death. It is a slow and agonizing end to a slow and agonizing life. You noticed it, didn't you? How cold my hand was.
As I said,
The doctor hoped that nothing of what he felt was visible on his face.
no more than is reasonable.
The other day,
He continued, leaning forward in his bonds.
I felt an itch in my shoulder. Just that. A little itch.
He shifted, his lidless and encrusted eyes boring into the doctor's.
Do you know what it was?
The doctor felt a bizarre urge to break eye contact, but found himself powerless to do so. Something about the master's stillness was keeping him transfixed as well as powerfully immobilizing as any number of chains.
It came out a day or so later.
The master said, voice almost a whisper.
A little thing, so white in all this darkness. One young maggot. So fresh, so alive. It must have been gorging itself on me for quite a while.
A prickle rolled through the doctor's shoulder for a soundless moment.
Did it hurt?
He asked, at a loss of what else to say. The master slumped back again, expressionless.
It might have done. I couldn't tell.
Another long silence passed between them. The barred square of light above the master's head was dimming, the colours of this planet's night rolling in. Though the whiteness of the sky appeared drab, it didn't seem to be the result of clouds. There was no texture to it, no telltale imperfections that would suggest the atmosphere was being covered. The white day was shifting into a steady grey evening, a stubborn monochrome just like the rest of this place. When that light faded entirely, the doctor would be unable to see a thing, and the master's condition suggested he wasn't making it till the morning either. Assuming, of course, that this really wasn't all one elaborate ruse.
Tell me about this place.
The doctor said suddenly.
How did you end up like this? I've heard of being thrown into a dungeon to rot, but if you'll forgive me for saying so, it doesn't usually end quite so literally. Not for you, at least.
The master wheezed out a laugh, like his lungs were filled with gravel.
You only have to get unlucky once, you know.
Smiling wildly, the doctor reciprocated his false joviality.
Well, you've more experience with it than I do.
That knocked the humour out of him. Without skin, it was next to impossible to scowl with any effectiveness, but the master was certainly doing his best.
I believe I've gone the way of all despised men, Doctor. I've been forgotten.
What a shame.
Isn't it just?
His eyes, so far as they could, grated upwards and his chin tilted as if he were trying to crane his neck.
This little square of light is my only connection to the outside world. Aside from watching the days and nights pass, I haven't seen another soul for the entirety of this pathetic species' living memory. One can only hope that I live on through legends. Scaring children, I presume.
And yet your cell is utterly clean.
The doctor pointed out, voice growing involuntarily louder.
The floors are spotless, there's not a trace of dust or rust on the bars. Your chains must be as shiny as the day you were locked in them. Really, Master, if you're going to lie to me, I would suggest you make it less obvious than this.
Something opaque twisted over the master's former features. It sent a shiver down the doctor's spine. The sort that might have been vindication or guilt, but was impossible to identify conclusively as either.
You are a fool,
the Master said bitterly.
Can't you tell this whole place is artificial? Nothing here rust. No, this place has been abandoned for centuries. The palace above too, I'd wager. Perhaps even the whole city. I don't hear much through that little window these days.
His face darkened momentarily.
The only thing that decays in here is me.
Then, as if the cloud had passed over him, it lightened again.
I had feared you'd been spending far too much time amongst primitives. But to think you've forgotten about the existence of self-sanitation.
That isn't all,
the Doctor boomed. The Master looked up at him blankly.
If you've been locked up down here for as long as you say, it's completely impossible that you'd be talking to me right now. With no food or no water, you ought to be bones by now. Oh, I know you're getting there, you've told me already, but I can't accept that you survived this long on air alone.
My force of will?
He groaned loudly.
Oh, don't start with that. I might as be great as a fool as you say, Master, but even I know the limits of our species.
The two of them looked at each other for a moment, the air unpleasantly stained with suspicious silence. The Master's expression was inscrutable in the way the Doctor recognised perfectly. He was trying to work out the right thing to say next. Sighing, the Doctor glanced out of the window again. It really was getting dark. He'd been hoping for some sort of sunset, but the sky was still scraping its way into increasingly lower tones of grey. So perhaps it was time to abandon that particular hope.
Just stop thinking about it, Master. It doesn't matter.
For the first time since he'd arrived there, the Master looked legitimately shocked, the ridge of his brow lifting slightly.
It doesn't.
No.
The Doctor blew out a breath, readjusted himself to sit on his hands.
If you're lying to me and I do as you ask, you drain me dry of my regenerations and walk out of here a free man, having learned nothing, to wreak havoc on the universe as you please. If you're telling me the truth, it certainly might be easier on your conscience. What's left of it. But the results is still the same, isn't it?
Doctor,
the Master began, voice uncharacteristically forlorn. He silenced him with a raised hand.
Go on and tell me I'm wrong.
There was a moment where the Doctor thought the Master might actually try it. His mouth parted as if to say something, and his expression rearranged itself into a mask of what was probably supposed to be angelic virtue. Then it dropped all at once. Irrationally, the Doctor felt his heart's twist, just the tiniest amount.
I thought not.
For a long moment, neither man said a word. The silence somehow hung heavier than before, and a traitorous thought snuck up on the Doctor, that he would have been better off just to leave the Master as soon as he found him, not have insisted on trying to reason with him. The best time to do so would have been as soon as he arrived. The second best time, at least, seemed to be right now. The Doctor rose to his feet in silence.
I can't change myself, Doctor.
The Master's voice was quiet. If he didn't know better, the Doctor would have called it flimsy. He scoffed, anyway.
Can't or won't?
I wouldn't have to take all your regenerations. I could always restrain myself to just a few.
Master, if your best suggestion is that I put all my lives into your hands and just trust you not to kill me, I'm afraid the case you're making isn't very convincing.
The Doctor intoned.
I would be forever in your debt.
The Master protested.
You know that.
A light rattling filled the space between them as the Doctor leaned back against the faux metal bars of the cell.
And it would be more the reason for you not to let me live, wouldn't it?
Do you think I have so little honor?
I know so.
It was getting dark now. It was the kind of darkness that couldn't stand a light. A night that did not follow on from the day as its equal, but smothered it, put the world it covered on hold, forced a curfew of stillness on every living thing. The light from the window had grown so faint that the Doctor soon realised he couldn't make out the Master's face at all. Even the very shape of him was becoming quickly obscured in a gloom.
We could rule together.
The Master suggested suddenly.
I could make you Lord President. Give half of your lives to me, and I'll give half of the universe to you. It's a good deal.
The doctor took a second to gape, aghast.
Goodness me, why in the heavens would I want that?
He looked down at the master, amusement flickering over his face.
No wonder all your alliances break down if that's your idea of a good deal.
For some reason, the master didn't seem to find it funny.
Someone has to rule, Doctor. No matter where you go. It's the natural order of things. Would you really rather all the power in the universe to go to the corrupt and the caustic?
What, like you?
The doctor shook his head.
Of course not. But I'm still not interested. It doesn't matter how many times you ask me this question, my answer is very unlikely to change.
The master sighed.
I suppose not. Still, it is a shame.
What?
You and your bleeding hearts. We could have ruled Gallifrey by the time we were 300. If you hadn't insisted on being so stubbornly sanctimonious.
He hissed the last word like a curse, like it burned his tongue just to say it.
You have no idea of the potential you have. Gallifrey is practically falling over themselves to make you president. If they could only get you to stop running away at the first sign of responsibility.
He heaved in a shuddering breath, and the doctor could hear it wheeze at the base of his lungs.
Yet here we are.
We're a long way from Gallifrey now,
said the doctor. The master's eyes tilted again towards the ceiling, as if searching for stars that were not there.
That we are.
A beat passed between them in the darkness, and almost unconsciously, the doctor sank down to be at the master's level again.
You really are dying, aren't you?
When he didn't respond, the doctor shifted towards him just a little.
Master.
Yes. I didn't think it would be like this.
He looked down again, meeting the doctor with yellowed eyes, now the only visible feature on his face. The darkness was probably fortunate, the doctor reasoned. Death was not something often flattered by the light.
It doesn't have to be this way, you know. If you saved me now, perhaps we could leave together. We could travel.
In the blackness, his eyes were searching, shifting minutely over the doctor's face.
Isn't that what you used to want?
The doctor couldn't tell what the master made of the look on his face, but whatever it was didn't stop him continuing.
I'm still myself, and you're still yourself. We could try and make things work again, you know.
Don't.
He blurted out suddenly.
Don't fall back on this. Don't use this against me.
The master fell silent, radiating something that the doctor might once have been foolish enough to mistake for hurt.
Doesn't it still matter to you?
I never said it didn't.
The doctor's voice was growing louder now. It took a great deal of self-control to bring it back down.
But don't use it like this. Just leave it be.
He hesitated for a second, choosing his next words carefully, slowly.
I don't trust you. I don't have any reason to do a thing for you.
The doctor paused. Grateful, the master probably couldn't see his expression in the darkness.
I can't give you my life, even if I could forgive you. I just can't.
I'm not asking for forgiveness.
The master said quietly, then sarcastically.
Not from you, at least. You can't reject all responsibility and still make yourself the sole arbiter of good and evil in the universe.
What do you want, then?
The doctor asked.
Kindness.
The master's voice was flat, without humour, but also without embarrassment.
Pity. I'm begging for my life.
The frailty of his voice hit the doctor twice, first in surprise, then in horrified sympathy. His weakness was evidently not a matter of choice. Given how close the master was to death, he was starting to grow tired, losing his ability to properly emote. Whatever decision he came to, he had to make it fast.
I know you don't owe me anything, Doctor. If I were you, I'd have left in disgust long ago.
The master outstretched his hand into the darkness, into the blindness that had descended over both of them, so that the doctor could just make out its shape.
But if you are so insistent on your moral superiority, then prove it. Show mercy to your...
Enough,
said the doctor, and, with reluctance, withdrew his hand from his coat, flooding the room with light. It was dazzling, a brilliant, living amber shivering with veins of gold like the summer sun on the surface of still water, and in the black and emptiness it turned the master's cell to dawn. Great honeyed streaks of liquid light spilled from his fingers and painted the walls with warmth and colour, the energy of pure, unapologetic, undiluted life burned between them, holding back for just a moment both the sterility and the decay. The master strained to grasp it, but his chains held him fast, and still the doctor hesitated, taking in the state of him, his emaciated form, his peeling skin, his fervent eyes, and held his golden touch just out of reach.
I need you to be honest with me,
he said, and this time he didn't bother to hide the desperation on his own illuminated face.
Whether this is a trap or not, I want you to tell me.
Doctor?
Just tell me the truth. No games. Be honest with me. Just this once.
But when the master's eyes finally snapped away from the doctor's hand and up to his face, that same expression from earlier was fastened upon it. That inscrutable hesitation, the gears turning in his mind as he tried to work out which answer was correct, as he tried to deduce the best way to manipulate the doctor, to tell him what he thought he wanted to hear. For a mere moment, time was still, and something deep inside the doctor tore in two all over again. Bang! The doctor whirled his head, nearly jumping out of his skin. He cast his eyes around, the light inexorably starting to fade from his hand, leaving the both of them in the dark again. There was another loud bang, the rush of coordinated footsteps, and a distant rattling that was unmistakably gunfire.
You said this place was abandoned!
The doctor cried, hastening to his feet. Now their world was plunged into blackness again. There was no hope of gleaning clues from the master's face. A rattle issued from his general direction, but whether it was an attempt to laugh or a groan of despair, the doctor couldn't tell.
I'm leaving,
he announced over the commotion. Above them, the sound of boots grew louder. There was shouting, more gunfire. The second the doctor turned away from him, the master tried again.
Doctor?
Oh, give it a rest.
He pushed the cell door open, glancing back at the crumpled outline of the master.
You've made your point abundantly clear, I think.
Don't,
he begged weakly, and if he'd had the lacriminal faculties left to do so, the doctor was certain he would have started crying crocodile tears. He turned his head away.
If you trust me so little that you can't even give me a straight answer, I'll hardly trust you with my life.
will you just sit down and stay with me for once in your lives?
The doctor ignored him, swinging the bar door shut behind him. It shut with a perfunctory and incongruous click.
You had your chance.
Behind him, there was a noise, a cry, one that morphed into a howl, a roar, and then became something disconcertingly like a wail.
Doctor!
As loud as the noise above him became, and as far from the prison as he got, it echoed in his ears no matter how quickly he walked away. So instead, the doctor ran. The air in the TARDIS was blessedly light and the hum of the ship was reassuringly familiar. To the doctor's immense relief, they took off with no trouble at all. The quietness was barely noticeable compared to the deafening silence he'd just escaped, and for once, the doctor was glad there was no one around to demand answers of him. There was a foul taste in his mouth, heavy and grey, like breathing ash. I should have apologised, he thought. Then, quite suddenly, he shook himself and resolved to never think of it again. His shoulder itched. Just a tiny thing, but it stung. He reached up to scratch it. Some things never did leave you after all.